Hi, everyone. Welcome back. As we kind of slowly filter back in from our break and from the first half of the connections, I'm really excited to get started for our second half, where we are going to be hearing from our next set of speakers. So without further ado, it gives me a lot of pleasure to introduce Dr. Lauren Heine and Stacy Glass from CHEMForward. They are the co-founders of CHEMForward. Stacy is the executive director, and she draws from 25 years of experience encompassing management consulting, high growth startups, public-private partnerships, and she has an MBA from Duke University. She's co-designed and proof of concept piloted chemical hazard information alongside partners like Target, Google, Nike, Levi's, Method, Steelcase, and more. And her work is extremely far-reaching and puts safer chemistry very central to the circular economy. Lauren Heine is a co-founder and director of science and data integrity at CHEMForward. She earned her doctorate in civil and environmental engineering from Duke University. She was a fellow with the American Association for the Advancement of Science in the Green Chemistry program at the US EPA, and she taught chemistry labs at Bowdoin College. Lauren is currently an adjunct faculty in the Center for Engineering, Design, and Entrepreneurship at Gonzaga University, which she has in addition to her position at CHEMForward. And she's known for many things, but one that this audience might be most familiar with is for leading the creation and development of Green Screen for safer chemicals and GS List Translator, which is increasingly used for chemical hazard assessment worldwide. So very topical as we just came out of our toxicology for chemists breakout rooms. Stacy and Lauren work together to protect human and environmental health by applying alternatives assessment, green chemistry, green engineering, and multi-stakeholder collaboration to the development of products and processes. So I'm very excited to hear from them. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Stacy and Lauren can take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I'm Stacy Glass, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me get this in slideshow mode. And Lauren and I hadn't coordinated this, but Lauren, I'm either happy to turn the screen over to you or run your slides. You just let me know when the time comes up.
If you don't mind running the slides, that would be great.
Will do. I'm going to start out with a brief introduction here and then turn it over to Lauren to take on more of the deep dive into this. But in the introduction, you understand what we're trying to do here is really scale the availability of chemical hazard assessments with a focus on safer alternatives. We are working to turn this chemical data into positive impact. And in today's talk, you're a little bit different audience for us. We've built an infrastructure for business, and we're curious if this could be used for toxicology and chemistry education. So we're really looking for your keen eye on what we've done and your thoughts and ideas about if this could be useful in that application. So we're going to show you what we've built and solicit your ideas, some things to think about as you see the demo here. Should these tools be repurposed for education? Where could hazard assessment information contribute to education? Your ideas will really help us determine next steps, but I also think it's cool that we get to, I know a lot of you are practitioners as well. We can show you what we've done and this new resource that we've developed. So what we're aiming to do here is as companies, as designers work towards safer chemistry, we know that they are starting to kind of understand what's in their supply chain. They can use several tools to do that, but this is really that transparency disclosure exercise. And then they'll screen what they know against regulatory compliance, restricted substances, lists, requirements, and authoritative lists, and even precautionary lists, like you can find, ChemSec and Pharos data sets. And what we always say is this is a great place to start, right? It allows you to get rid of the worst of the worst, and that's what we need to focus on first. It also allows you to make free of claims, free of BPA, no PFAS, those kinds of things. So great place to start, but we also say it's a terrible place to stop because it can lead to regrettable substitutions. Not everything is on a list. Many things aren't on a list. It's really the worst of the worst that end up on those lists. And truly, as we start to find substitutions for these things that we're eliminating, How do we avoid regrettable substitutions and move towards truly verified, safer chemistry, and maybe even be able to make safer claims about what we're doing? And the gap there are these chemical hazard assessments. And let me just talk about that. I usually don't have Lauren here with me, but I'm going to quote her anyway, even though she's here. Why chemical hazard assessments? Well, toxic is easy, safe is hard. It takes a lot more information to prove that a chemical is safe than it does to prove that it's toxic. We might just know that a chemical is carcinogenic, and great, you're not going to use it. Let's get it out of there. But to say that it's safe, we need to look across the whole range of human and environmental endpoints. And here's an example of a hazard table that supports a chemical hazard assessment. And once we look at all of this, then we can say, okay, this is a safer alternative. And I'll note that we'll be talking hazard. We think of the hazard assessment as the foundational information. You might then need to look at routes of exposure, notice over here on the left, oral, dermal, and inhalation down there in the corner. And then you might have your own thoughts about risk assessment and things like that on top of it. But if we don't have that foundational hazard assessment right, then we're sort of building a house of cards. So we unapologetically are building a hazard data set here that people can use for their purposes. So we are a science-based nonprofit value chain collaboration. We're aiming to be a trusted source for cost-effective, verified chemical hazard information with a focus on safer alternatives. When we did our design phase and interviewed all these folks and dozens more, what they told us is like, we understand what we're not supposed to use. We don't know what we're supposed to use instead. And that's where our design phase started. You'll notice a lot of great brands here. I'll call out Apple and Nike in particular. They've been doing this for a decade or more, doing their own chemical hazard assessments. And they joined our co-design effort, not to solve a problem for them necessarily, but to achieve their safer chemistry goals, their entire supply chain needed access to this kind of information. And so they joined us to help us create something scalable. So we use this data sharing model. We have this shared repository of chemical hazard information that goes through a really rigorous quality assurance process. The information is created by toxicology firms, many of the names you probably know, Tox Services, NSF, Gradient, those folks. And then we use this shared database to help folks find safer alternatives. They might subscribe to our platform, help chemical suppliers market their safer alternatives, even help like retailers measure progress. Guest joined us here in the presentation. Mossy May woke up from her nap. Apologies for that. You go lay down. And so these are the things that we help folks do with that shared data set and helping them with concurrent chemical management strategies. So we know that they have to eliminate those bad things, also make informed substitutions, and hopefully design with the good stuff from the very beginning. And that's our goal. And when Lauren and I first met 12 plus years ago, we used a common slide that showed these as steps. And we thought someday they'll be able to design with the green stuff. But now, a decade later, we can say these are really concurrent chemical management strategies because we're building this database to allow that to happen. One last thing before I turn it over to Lauren. For eliminating high hazards, we've partnered with the Healthy Building Network. They have the Pharos tool. Many of you might be familiar with that. It's a list of lists using List Translator. And we wanted to be really consistent with the folks who use Pharos and how we were sharing the same information here. So we have an API from Pharos to our system, and then we add chemical hazards on top of those that start to go beyond what not to use and really start to what to use instead. So with that, I'd like to turn you over to my co-founder, Lauren Heine, to talk more about this data set. Lauren?
Thank you, Stacy, and thank you for having us Beyond Benign. We're really excited to be with this community and also to explore the potential for the tool that we developed to be used for educational purposes. And the tool has two sides. There's the back end where the assessors enter all of the information, and there's the front end where subscribers view the information in different formats. And I'll show you a little bit of that. I wish I could have been here for the first hour, but we have a regular assessor verifier call I had to participate in. So I feel like I missed the early discussion, but I'll put this out here and hopefully engage in discussion. Please don't hesitate to ask questions. Chemical hazard assessment, as you may or may not know, is a systematic process of assessing and classifying hazards across a spectrum of hazard endpoints and severity. By hazard endpoints, I mean carcinogenicity, aquatic toxicity, things like that. Most of them are based in the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling, which began, gosh, I think in 2006 and is updated 2004 and is updated every 2 years by the United Nations. We're on revision 9, so you'll see different revision numbers. So that's the purple book, and it's referred to as GHS. There are other methods are Cradle to Cradle as part of their material health methodology. Safer Choice has, or Design for the Environment has their criteria. Green Screen for Safer Chemicals is another method for hazard assessment. Next slide, please. And they're primarily GHS with some differences that I'll show you shortly. But one of the challenges is CHEMForward. We're creating a centralized repository, and we're committed to this being very high quality information because we want there to be one chemical assessment per chemical and for them to be accessible at low cost. And to solve some of the problems, multiple CHA methods out in the world, the problems are that using the same methodology, assessors can arrive at different classification results. And then when the methodology varies, you get what appears to be more variability. They may not have different classifications, but they're presented as different levels. One calls it high, one calls it medium, one calls it red, one calls it yellow, that kind of thing. And so, but yet most, all of the methods are based primarily on GHS. Next slide, please. And an example of this is something that is a category 2 carcinogen in GHS is high in Safer Choice, it's medium in Green Screen, and it's red in Cradle to Cradle. But it's not telling you anything different. It's just different packaging for the same classification. So what we decided to do was to have one input in the back end that will allow us to present the results on the front end in different views. Same data, different views. Next slide, please. And so this is what it looks like in the back end. And the assessors go into the back end and they enter the data summary, and it could be a paragraph to a huge tome of information depending on what they find. They indicate their confidence level in the data. If it's just based on, say, analogs, or they just a lot of conflicting data, they may say low confidence. Then they write up the rationale, and the rationale is kind of the summary of the summary. Why did they say that this chemical is not classified and has low potential for oral carcinogenicity in the cradle-cradle method based on the data? And so they write that up, and it's short, and that's what you see in the front end of the app. You don't see the whole data summary on the back. You see the front end. And next slide, please. And then as part of this, so what happens is that the assessors enter the information, and it goes through a number of stages. First, it's, quote, submitted, and then we assign it to a verifier. And the verifier is a third-party independent toxicologist who reviews the data and makes comments. And it's sort of like a Google document where you put a comment and you can send it to somebody, and then they can add their comment. And it goes back and forth between the assessor and the verifier until the verifier is satisfied that, and sometimes it's an issue of clarity, sometimes there's a disagreement. If there's a disagreement, then it goes to the CHEMForward toxicologist, who then weighs in, either convenes a discussion or actually, 2 out of 3, and the assessors have agreed to go with the CHEMForward assessor when the toxicologist when there's a conflict. But we see this as kind of there's an educational potential here, whereas imagining students could prepare an assessment and the instructor could make comments on it, or maybe other students could make comments on it, and everybody would have access to the result on the front end, but there could be discussion on the back end. And so once the next slide, please. Once the assessor verifier, they go back and forth a little bit. Once the verifier is happy, they click verified. There is a record of all the comments that you can download as an Excel file. So we have records about everything, and then you can flip over to the front end to see what the view looks like on the user side of the app. And you can search on the user side by CAS number, EC number, INCI name, chemical name, up in the search by, or you can search by function. Say you're looking for cleaning ingredients, or let's say you're clicking on that applications there. You can look by function, which would be solvents, chelating agents, whatever, emollients, depending on which vertical you're in. We separate them out by electronics, by beauty and personal care, packaging, etc. Next slide, please. And then you can click on any individual chemical. And this is the one you're looking at the back end of. This one got a very good score. And you see on the first tab, there's a summary. It tells you who did the assessment, when it was verified. You can see the cradle to cradle rating, whether there are any GHS health or environmental scores in this is actually an old slide. We include the GHS harmonized classifications too, if there are any. This wouldn't have any because there are no real hazards associated with it. Gives you the green screen score on the TCO certified, whether or not it's on the EPA skill. Next slide, please.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can go over to the hazard tab and you can see what this looks like in the GHS only view. So again, the data, there's only one set of data that get entered in the back, but it displays it differently depending on which lens you're looking at. And right now we have 2 lenses. We have GHS and cradle to cradle lenses, and they look different. They're slightly different endpoints. I think I'll show you that in a little bit. Next slide, please. If you click on one of the cells, you can see the rationale. I showed you the rationale on the back, the summary of the summary. You can see there, we do allow people, like if, we have subscribers from government, and if they want to see the back end data, they're not sure about something, we allow them to go in and look at the data summary, but generally it's not from the front end. Next slide, please. And then this is what it looks like in the cradle to cradle view. We've picked a very nice chemical here with no real hazards. But it does have some data gaps, endocrine disruption. If you had clicked on that one, which it's not live, you'd see that there was a discussion of no evidence of the endocrine disruption, but it's almost impossible to prove no endocrine disruption given all the studies you have to do, and androgenic, anti-androgenic, thyroid, estrogenic, you can test it. It's very difficult to prove a negative. So, but that when it's a gray, that means there's no evidence anywhere that it's endocrine active. And cradle to cradle breaks things out in slightly different ways. It breaks out the aquatic species, it adds persistence and bioaccumulation, climatic relevance, things like that. Next slide, please. So you can see that we think that we call it harmonized ratings, but we've developed these hazard bands because it can be a little confusing if you're talking about a score in cradle to cradle versus skill versus green screen. So we use these hazard bands, and we consider these to be equivalent. Cradle to cradle B or C/B is equivalent to EPA skill, green full circle, equivalent to a green screen 3, benchmark 3 or 3 TPDG. And so it allows you to use multiple methods to get more information and more insight on various chemicals. These are the hazard bands we use, the ABC. There's an F for things that would be a substance of very high concern. A U, we don't like those because that means we've done all the work and there's hardly any data and it's difficult to model. And a question mark means it's not on a bad list, but we don't really have enough information to say what the hazard band would be. Next slide, please. So again, I'll just reiterate, we want this to be really high quality information. We build on existing methodologies. We have not created our own methodology. We use qualified assessors. We use a verification process. We have a challenge process whereby anyone can challenge a particular classification, NGO, industry, other assessor. And we do allow the use of private data. It happens sometimes that a manufacturer might have test studies we can use, but they have to show it to both the assessor and the verifier. So we know that's robust. And we started recently, I think Stacy showed that in a slide, also looking at trade name ingredients, not just chemicals by CAS number. And when we look at a trade name, we look at the impurities and any other additives because there's always something else in there. Next slide, please. I think that's it. That's a very quick overview of how this works, but we're very interested in how this might be useful for education. We've even been told it could be useful for industry, for toxicology teams and companies to share their data across across countries, across regions, whatever. But we built it to provide information to people. So we think there's potential for students to use the information in the user view, but maybe there's also potential to use the backend for educational purposes. So we would welcome your thoughts. And if you have any questions and ideas, we'd welcome that.
Thank you very much for a really fantastic talk and for a very thorough overview of this extremely helpful tool. So we do have a couple minutes for questions and I would like to open the floor. Please feel free to unmute, raise your hand, drop a question in the chat, anything you want.
This is Jay. I mean, I could ask from an educational standpoint. So one of the things we did after signing the pledge was to form a committee to look at our labs and to see how we can update our labs. So is this resource that education, we can use to update our labs to find chemicals that are alternatives to the ones that we are using? Or have you maybe as a company thought about how you could reach out to higher education to facilitate that? Because it wasn't easy sometimes.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think there's a couple of ways. We haven't focused on lab, curricula specifically, but we are working on a solvent database. So if I guess it would depend on what you're replacing. And there are two things. You would either come to a database like this to look for existing alternatives to see what are my options, or you could come to a database like this and say, I have a couple of candidates I'm interested in, let me see if they're safer. So I don't know if you have which category you would fall in. Do you have ideas already, or are you looking for, and what kinds of chemicals are they,
Yeah, I think it falls into both categories. So I need to go, they provided us with the report, so I need to go back and look at it. The pandemic kind of put a halt to all of this stuff. So I have to go back and remind myself. But I think we were in both categories. So
yeah, we could definitely help you with this. I mean, right now we're just exploring things. When we have funding, we make the what we call verticals freely available. When we don't, there's a subscription cost, and we would certainly either do our best to donate or minimize any costs for academic purposes. Or if you just have questions,
thank you.
Yeah, or call us up and ask us if you have a specific chemical in mind. We'll just show you.
So Pat, I can see your hand up, but I did want to ask a question that came up in the chat just super quickly. And then actually when we head out into breakout rooms, Lauren and Stacy will be in a breakout room. And you can also feel free to continue asking questions as well there. But before we head into those rooms, Dr. Kylie Leska, who had to leave, was wondering if you have any case studies of CHEMForward having worked with one of your companies or your partners in making a more sustainable selection. So doing that kind of assessment process.
Yes, we do. We have, if you were to look at, say, in the beauty and personal care vertical, I don't know if we can pull that up.
Oh, I sure can. Yeah.
We have done research on alternatives to chemicals of concern to certain beauty companies like Sephora and Cradle. So we have alternatives to what is it, cyclic silicones, alternatives to ethanolamines. And so these were research projects that resulted in it's in the where it says safer alternatives. So so up at the top, yeah, alternatives to cyclic silicones, alternatives to ethanolamines, alternatives to phthalate fragrance solvents and fixatives. These were research projects. One was funded by the state of Washington, 2 were funded by Sephora. So we can pool specific alternatives that way into categories. So if you were to click on, say, alternatives to phthalate fragrance solvents and fixatives, Stacy, it takes you to a small set of chemicals that have been identified that can substitute for DEP, and that you can see what their hazard bands are, and then click on any of those to see what their hazard properties are. That's how we would use it for as a we hadn't written it up as a case study, but that's what it is, a case study.
No, that's perfect. And I think definitely as instructors are looking for examples of these case studies to show their students, that would be like knowing that they can walk through this process is really, really useful.
That's a great suggestion. And Lauren, I'll take that one step further with that dimethicone example of like, it looks really good in here, but then when we go to evaluate a trade name, so we could even take that a step further. Yeah. But the idea to do case studies to support education is something we had not thought about, and I see it clearly now.
Yeah. And that one actually, this one was actually funded by the state of Washington. So it is a report that's published, but it's a long report and not a case study. So you could make something a lot shorter.